Chapter 1. The Judgment. The late afternoon sun hung low, spilling a copper light over Dust Creek's main street. Heat shimmered above the packed earth, and every step kicked up little swirls of red dust. The air was heavy with the scent of horse sweat and dry sagebrush, and from somewhere down the street, the faint strains of a piano drifted from the saloon, mingling with the muffled chatter of cowhands and the clinking of spurs on warped wooden planks. Clara stood in front of the sheriff's office, her hands trembling inside the folds of her faded calico dress. The dress had been her mother's once. Now it clung to her with the weight of shame. She could feel every eye on her. Men leaning against posts, women peeking from behind lace curtains, the whole town holding its breath, waiting to see just how hard Henry Carver would come down on his only daughter. Her father stood a few paces away, hat low over his brow, jaw tight as iron. The lines in his sun-baked face deepened as he looked at her, not with sorrow, but with the cold disappointment of a man who thought his name had been dragged through the mud. "You went and did the one thing I told you not to," he said, voice low, but cutting enough to carry. "Now you'll live with it." Clara's throat felt dry as dust. "Pa, I—" "Don't." He raised a hand, silencing her. "Talking won't change a damn thing. You made your bed, now you'll lie in it." A creak of leather drew her eyes to the man standing beside her father. He was taller than she'd expected, broad-shouldered, with a sun-faded duster that looked as if it had been mended a dozen times. A week's worth of stubble shadowed his jaw, and a scar curved from his temple down past his cheekbone. He met her gaze steadily, those eyes the color of storm clouds over the mountains, but said nothing. "This here's Elias Kane," her father said. "Lives up in the high country. Knows how to keep a woman fed and a roof over her head. He don't talk much, but he's got no use for lies. You'll go with him and you'll stay there, far from town, far from trouble." Clara's stomach twisted. "Pa, you can't just—" "I can and I am." His tone was final. Elias's voice, when it came, was quiet but carried a weight of its own. "She can ride?" "She'll learn," Henry said sharply, not looking at her. Clara felt heat flood her face, anger, fear, and something else she couldn't name. The thought of leaving Dust Creek, of leaving everything she'd known, wrapped around her like a noose. Yet, when her eyes met Elias's again, there was no cruelty there, just a steady, unreadable calm. Her father stepped back. "Mount up." The crowd shifted, boots scuffing against wood and dirt. Whispers floated through the air like dry leaves. Clara hesitated until Elias moved toward his horse, a big, dark bay with a black mane that shone in the sun. He swung up into the saddle with an easy grace, then extended a hand down to her. Her pulse thundered in her ears. For a heartbeat, she thought of running, of tearing down the street past the saloon, through the open prairie until her legs gave out. But the weight of every stair pinned her in place. She placed her hand in his. His grip was strong, warm, steady, pulling her up behind him. The bay shifted under them as Elias turned the horse toward the far end of town. Clara caught one last glimpse of her father, arms crossed, expression carved from stone, before the sun lit his figure in a golden blaze and then swallowed a whole. They rode past the saloon, where a few cowhands leaned against the railing, their eyes following her. The piano played a slow, mournful tune. Out beyond the last building, the town gave way to endless grass and low, rolling hills. The sky stretched wide, painted in streaks of fire and gold as the sun dipped lower. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sagebrush and a far-off cry of a coyote. Clara tightened her hold around Elias's waist, her fingers curling into the coarse fabric of his coat. She didn't know where he was taking her, or what kind of man he truly was. But one thing was certain. Her life in Dust Creek was over, and the mountains were calling her into a world as wild and dangerous as the man riding before her. Chapter 2. into the wild. The sun was sinking fast, throwing long shadows across the prairie as Elias's bay carried them farther from Dust Creek. The clatter of civilization faded with every hoofbeat, replaced by the creak of saddle leather and the soft swish of grass brushing against a horse's legs. Clara kept her hands tight around his waist at first, the steady sway of his body both strange and grounding. She felt the heat radiating from him, the faint scent of leather and pine clinging to his coat. Behind them, the town's glow dimmed into nothing more than a memory. Ahead, the land stretched open, wild, endless, and entirely unfamiliar. Elias didn't speak for miles. The only sounds were the rhythmic clop of hooves and the occasional cry of a hawk wheeling overhead. At last, he broke the silence. "You ever been this far from town?" Clara shook her head before remembering he couldn't see her. "No, Pa never let me." His voice was low, almost thoughtful. "Then you're seeing a different world tonight." They rode on. The air grew cooler as the light faded, a chill slipping through her thin dress. Elias must have noticed, because he shifted slightly and tugged his duster back, so it draped over her legs without a word. They crossed a narrow stream, the horses' hooves splashing through the cold water. Fireflies began to flicker in the reeds, their pale glow reflecting on the rippling surface. In the distance, the dark shape of the mountains loomed, their jagged peaks catching the last streaks of sunlight. Clara found herself staring at them with a mix of awe and dread. "Is that where you live?" Elias's profile was hard to read in the fading light, but she thought she saw a faint smile tug at one corner of his mouth. "Up there, cabin's about a half-day's ride from here." She hesitated. "And you live there alone?" "Have for years." "Why?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. His reply came slow. "Town's full of noise and people looking for trouble. I got no use for either." The way he said it left no room for further prying. Still, his tone wasn't unkind, just firm, like a man used to guarding more than just his land. By the time they stopped to rest the horse, the prairie had melted into foothills. The grass gave way to scrub pine, and the air smelled sharper, fresher. Elias swung down first, his boots landing solid on the packed earth. He turned and held out a hand to her. "Careful now." Clara slid down, her skirt brushing against his leg as she landed. The moment her feet touched the ground, she felt the stillness of the place wrap around her. No saloon chatter, no wagons rattling by. Just a sigh of wind through the pines and the distant trickle of water. Elias led the bay to a low patch of grass where it could graze, then reached into his saddlebag. "We'll camp here for the night. Easier than riding blind in the dark." She watched him work, a man who moved with unhurried precision, every motion deliberate. He unrolled a bedroll for himself, then took a blanket and handed it to her. "It'll get cold. Wrap up tight." She accepted it. The course was smelling faintly of smoke. "Thank you," she murmured. He crouched near a circle of stones and struck flint against steel. Sparks caught on the dry kindling, and soon a small fire flickered between them. The light danced across his face, catching the edge of that scar, making him look both dangerous and strangely safe. Clara sat across from him, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. She was still afraid of what tomorrow would bring, of the unknown that loomed ahead, but the fire's warmth seeped into her bones. She found herself studying him in the glow, the steady hands, the quiet strength in his movements, the way his gaze held hers without flinching. For the first time since her father's judgment, she felt something other than fear. It wasn't quite trust yet, but it was a start. Above them, the stars came out one by one, bright against the deep velvet of the sky. Somewhere far off, a coyote called, its lonely cry echoing through the hills. Elias tossed another log on the fire, the sparks drifting upward like little embers of an unspoken promise. Chapter 3. A Cabin in the Clouds. Morning broke crisp and clear, the kind of mountain dawn that painted the peaks in rose gold. Clara awoke to the smell of coffee and the softness of it boiling over a fire Elias had kindled before she stirred. The blanket he'd given her was tucked snug around her, and a pine bough beneath had made the ground less cruel through the night. Elias was crouched near the flames, pouring steaming coffee into a tin cup. His duster was off, hanging from a low branch, and the early light caught the broad line of his shoulders. "Best drink while it's hot," he said, handing her the cup. His tone wasn't warm exactly, but there was a certain quiet consideration in the way he offered it. The coffee was strong enough to make her eyes water, but it chased the night's chill from her chest. "Thank you," she murmured, fingers curling around the cup. They broke camp quickly, Elias moving with efficient, practiced motions, Clara mimicking him where she could. Soon they were mounted again, climbing into the high country. The land shifted as they went, rolling hills giving way to steeper slopes, pine forest thickening around them until the world was hushed beneath a canopy of green. Birdsong replaced the prairie's open wind. Shafts of sunlight lanced through the trees, catching on drifting motes of dust and pollen. Every so often, Elias would point out a narrow deer trail or a spring trickling from a mossy rock, his voice low but steady. By mid-afternoon, the trees thinned, and the trail opened onto a meadow ringed by the jagged arms of the mountains. Wildflowers nodded in the breeze, lupin, Indian paintbrush, and white daisies swaying in a sea of green. Beyond the meadow, perched on a rocky rise, stood the cabin. It was solid, built of thick timbers and crowned with a roof of weathered shingles. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney, and a split-rail fence corralled a small pen with a pair of grazing horses. Clara's breath caught. It wasn't grand, but it had a quiet dignity, standing proud against the sweep of wilderness. Elias reined in and glanced back at her. "Home." She swallowed. "It's beautiful." A flicker of something passed through his eyes, surprise, maybe, but he didn't answer. Instead, he nudged the bay forward, leading her into the yard. He swung down and offered her a hand. "Careful with that step," he said, nodding to the flat stone that served as a porch. She took his hand without thinking, feeling the callous warmth of his grip before he let go. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke. A single large room served as kitchen and living space, with stone hearth on one wall and shelves lined with jars, tins, and neatly stacked plates. A curtained alcove held a bed covered in a thick wool blanket. She turned slowly, taking it all in, the sturdy table by the window, the rocking chair near the fire, the rifle mounted above the mantel. Everything here was functional, built for survival, and yet she saw signs of care. The floor was swept, the tools on the wall oiled and hung with precision. Elias set her small satchel on the table. "You take the bed," he said simply. She blinked. "And where will you sleep?" "By the fire. Been doing for years." He said it like it was no hardship at all. Clara felt a strange ache in her chest. After the harshness of her father's words, the quiet dignity in Elias's gesture unsettled her more than any cruelty could have. He busied himself at the hearth, stirring the embers to life. "You hungry?" Her stomach answered before she could. He glanced up at the sound, a hint of a smile ghosting his lips. By evening, the fire cast a warm glow through the cabin. Elias had cooked a stew from rabbit and wild onions, serving it with rough slices of bread. They ate mostly in silence, though now and then their eyes met across the table. Outside, the wind whispered to the pines, and the sky bled into a deep indigo, stars pricking through one by one. Clara wrapped her hands around the warmth of the tin cup he'd filled with tea and realized she was not afraid. Not exactly. The mountains pressed close around the cabin, but instead of feeling trapped, she felt strangely safe. And when Elias banked the fire for the night, settling himself on a bedroll near the hearth. She caught herself watching the way the light played along his jaw. For the first time since she'd been forced onto his horse, she wondered if this exile might become something entirely different. Chapter 4. Thawing the Ice. The first few days in Elias Kane's cabin passed in an awkward rhythm. Clara kept mostly to herself, unsure what was expected of her in this wild, isolated world. Elias, for his part, spoke little, but never with sharpness. His silences were more like the stillness of the mountains and the cold of her father's voice. On the third morning, she rose early, the pale blue of dawn spilling to the small cabin window. Elias was already outside, splitting logs in the yard. The steady thud of his axe carried through the crisp air. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped out onto the flat stone porch. He glanced up briefly, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt despite the chill. "You're up early." "I couldn't sleep." She hesitated. "I could help." Elias paused mid-swing, studying her. "You ever split with before?" "No." A faint huff of amusement escaped him. "Then we'll start with something easier. Come on." He showed her how to gather kindling from the nearby pines, explaining how dried twigs snapped cleaner than green ones. She listened closely, more from the sound of his voice than the lesson itself. It was deep calm and edged with something she might one day call trust. By midday, they had a neat stack of kindling and firewood near the cabin. Elias nodded toward it. "That'll see us through a few cold nights." She smiled, and for the first time he returned it. Not fully, but enough for a spark of warmth to flicker between them. That evening, Clara decided to cook. She didn't have much to work with, but she found dried beans, a bit of salt pork, and onions in Elias's stores. While the pot simmered over the hearth, she glanced over her shoulder to find him watching from his chair, one boot propped on the hearthstone. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I want to," she replied, stirring the pot. "I've done enough sitting idle in my life." He said nothing, but his gaze lingered on her a moment longer before returning to the fire. They ate together at the table, the simple meal filling the cabin with a comforting smell. Elias surprised her by going back for a second helping. "It's good," he admitted. "Better than I'd have managed." The compliment caught her off guard. "Thank you." The days began to fall into a pattern. Elias tending to his traps and checking the fence line, Clara keeping the cabin tidy and learning the rhythm of mountain living. She found herself humming while sweeping or leaving a sprig of wildflowers in a chip jar on the table. She thought he didn't notice, but she'd catch him glancing at them, a softness in his eyes that vanished when she looked too long. One afternoon, a sudden mountain storm rolled in. The wind rattled the shutters, and rain pelted the roof like thrown gravel. Clara stood at the window, watching the mist swallow the meadow. Elias came in, shaking water from his hat. "Cold out there," he said, moving to the hearth. She fetched a towel and handed it to him without thinking. He took it, their fingers brushing. For a heartbeat, they simply stood there, close enough that she could hear the quiet rasp of his breath, smell the rain and pine on his coat. "Thank you," he murmured, voice low. That night, they lingered by the fire after supper. The rain had eased, leaving only the occasional drip from the eaves. The firelight painted his face in gold and shadow. Clara found herself telling him about the creek she used to visit as a child, how she'd sneak away to read in the shade of a cottonwood. Elias listened without interrupting, his eyes fixed on her like he was committing every word to memory. When she faltered, uncertain why she was telling him such things, he said quietly, "Sounds like you belonged out here all along." The words settled over her like a warm blanket. For the first time, the cabin didn't feel like a place she'd been sent to endure. It felt like a place she might choose to stay. And though neither of them moved closer, the air between them felt charged, as if the distance could vanish with one step. Chapter 5. Trouble on the Horizon. The next morning broke sharp and clear, the rain-washed sky an impossible blue. Clara was gathering laundry from the line behind the cabin when she noticed Elias's horse lifting its head, ears pricked toward the trail below. She followed the animal's gaze and froze. 3 riders were coming up the narrow path. Strangers, their dusters snapping the breeze, rifles slung casually but within easy reach. Even from a distance, she could feel their eyes sweeping the land like men who weighed and claimed what they saw. Elias stepped out from the barn, a coil of rope in his hands. His gaze followed hers, and his jaw tightened. "Get inside," he said, his voice low but firm. "What is it?" she asked, heart pounding. "Just go." He didn't wait for an answer, striding to where his rifle leaned by the cabin door. Clara hurried inside, but stayed near the window, peeking through the curtain. The riders slowed as they entered the yard, boots thudding in the stirrups, spurs giving a faint jingle. Their leader, a tall man with a black hat pulled low and a crooked smile, tipped his head toward Elias. "Kane," the man drawled, "been a while." "Not long enough, Coil," Elias replied. His voice was calm, but the way his fingers rested near the rifle told a different story. The man, Coil, glanced around the yard, his eyes lingering a beat too long on the laundry line, on the smaller boots by the door. "Heard you got company up here," he said, a smirk curling his lip. "Not your usual style." Elias's stance didn't shift. "She's none of your concern." Coil chuckled, the sound low and unpleasant. "Everything in these hills is my concern. You know how it works. Folks pay for protection, or they find trouble in their yard." Elias stepped forward, closing the space between them by a few feet. "You won't find trouble here unless you bring it." Clara's hands curled into fists at her sides. She didn't know who these men were, but she knew the kind: slick voices, easy smiles, eyes that promised ruin. Coil tilted his head, studying Elias like a man sizing up an opponent. "We'll be back through in a few days," he said finally. "Maybe you'll have reconsidered our offer." With that, he turned his horse, the other 2 following. They rode off down the trail, dust rising in their wake. Clara stepped out onto the porch as Elias lowered the rifle. "Who were they?" she asked. "Trouble," he said simply. She waited, but he didn't elaborate, moving instead to check the fence line as if the conversation were done. But she saw the way his eyes scanned the tree line, the way his shoulders stayed tense even after the riders disappeared. That night, supper was quiet. Elias's mind was clearly elsewhere, his gaze flicking now and then to the window, as though expecting movement in the dark. Finally, Clara broke the silence. "They know about me," she said softly. His head came up, his expression unreadable. "They won't get near you. But if they come back—" "They'll come back," he interrupted, his tone flat. "Men like Coil don't take no kindly. But I've dealt with his kind before." Clara swallowed. "Why do I feel like I'm the reason this got worse?" Elias leaned forward, elbows on the table. "You're not the reason, Clara. This was bound to come. But now I've got one more reason to make sure they don't take an inch of this land." There was something in the way he said it, protective, fierce, that sent a shiver down her spine. Later, as the fire burned low, she lay in the bed while Elias sat watch by the hearth, his rifle propped within arm's reach. The soft crackle of the fire was broken only by the wind moving through the pines. Clara stared at the ceiling, the weight of his words still heavy in her chest. Out there in the dark, danger was circling. But here, inside the cabin, she felt the strange certainty that Elias Kane would stand between her and the world, no matter the cost. Chapter 6: Fire and Gunpowder. The wind was restless that night, sweeping through the pines in low moans. Clara sat by the hearth, pretending to mend a shirt while her eyes kept flicking toward the door. Elias was outside making a final check of the yard, his lantern bobbing between the fence posts. When he stepped back inside, his jaw was set like stone. "They're out there," he said, voice low. "Not close yet, but close enough to smell trouble." Her needles stilled in her fingers. "Coil! Coil!" Elias confirmed. He crossed to the wall, lifted the rifle from its rack, and checked the chamber with practiced efficiency. The minutes crawled. The fire's crackle was loud in the tense silence. Then hoofbeats, faint at first, then pounding in the hard-packed earth outside. Elias moved to the window, peering through the curtain. "Stay low," he murmured. 3 shadows emerged from the tree line, lantern light glinting off gun barrels. Coyle's voice carried through the cold air. "Evening, Kane. Thought we'd come by. See if you had time to think about our offer." Elias stepped out onto the porch, rifle cradle but ready. Clara crept to the doorway, heart hammering. "No offer to think about." Elias called back. "You ride off now, no one gets hurt." Coyle's laugh was sharp, mocking. "You think you can hole up here and keep everything for yourself? We take what we want in these hills." His gaze shifted past Elias, toward the faint outline of Clara behind the doorway. "And maybe we'll take her too." Something in Elias snapped. He raised a rifle, his voice like iron. "You take one step toward her, and you'll be dead before your boot hits the ground." For a moment, the night held still. Then a pistol flashed in Coyle's hand. The crack of gunfire shattered the quiet, the bullet splintering would above Elias's head. Elias fired back, the roar of the rifle echoing off the mountains. Coyle's men scattered, taking cover behind the fence posts. Muzzle flashes flared in the dark, the smell of gunpowder rolling through the cold air. "Clara!" Elias called without looking back. "Stay down." But she didn't cower in the far corner. She grabbed the second rifle from above the hearth, hands trembling but determined. She crawled to the window, bracing on the sill the way she'd seen Elias do. When one of Coyle's men broke cover, charging for the porch, she squeezed the trigger. The shot went wide, but close enough to make him dive for the dirt. "Good girl." Elias barked, reloading fast. The fight was chaos, shouts, gunfire, the crash of boots on the porch. One outlaw lunged from the shadows, tackling Elias into the wall. The rifle clattered to the floor. They grappled, the man's knife flashing in the firelight. Without thinking, Clara grabbed a heavy iron poker from beside the hearth and swung with all her strength. The blow caught the attacker's shoulder, sending him sprawling. Elias finished it with a swift punch that left the man groaning in the dirt. Coyle cursed, firing one last shot before swinging on to his horse. "This ain't over, Kane," he yelled, galloping into the trees with his men. Silence fell, broken only by the ragged sound of Elias's breathing. He leaned against the wall. One hand pressed his arm where blood seeped through his sleeve. Clara dropped the poker and rushed him. "You're hurt." "It's just a graze," he said, though his face was pale. She guided him to the chair by the fire, fetching a basin of water and a strip of clean cloth. Her hands shook as she cleaned the wound, but she kept her voice steady. "Don't you ever scare me like that again." Elias's gaze locked with hers. "You're the one who scared me, running to that window with a rifle." "I wasn't going to hide while they tried to take what's mine," she said, the words out before she could stop them. His expression softened, just for a moment. "What's yours?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." Elias reached up, his fingers brushing hers. "Then I reckon I'll make damn sure no one ever lays a hand on what's yours or mine." Outside, the wind had quieted, but the smell of gunpowder lingered, a reminder that the danger wasn't gone. Yet in that firelit moment, with her hand in his, Clara knew the line between fear and something deeper had blurred beyond recognition. Chapter 7. Confessions by Lamplight. The cabin was quiet again, but the kind of quiet that comes only after violence. Heavy, taut, like the land itself was still listening for danger. Outside, the moon hung over the mountains, pale light spilling across the meadow. Clara wrung out the last strip of clean cloth and pressed it gently against Elias's arm. The wound had stopped bleeding, but her hands refused to stop trembling. She tried to hide it, keeping her focus on the task. "You should rest," she murmured. Elias shook his head. "I'll rest when I'm sure they're gone for good." She tied the cloth snug, refusing to meet his eyes. "And if they're not, then I'll still be here," he said, his voice low. "Between you and them." The words tightened something in her chest. She leaned back, studying him in the flickering glow of the oil lamp. The light painted his face in gold and shadow, tracing the hard lines of his jaw, softening the storm gray of his eyes. "You didn't have to take me in," she said finally. "You could have refused my father, sent me back." Elias looked away, staring into the flames. "I could have," he admitted. "But the first time I saw you standing there, dressed all dusty, eyes full of fight even when you were scared to death, I knew I wouldn't let you go back to a man who'd throw you away like a piece of worn-out tack." Her throat tightened. "You don't even know me." A faint smile tugged at his lips. "I know enough. I've seen women who survive by bending, and women who survive by standing. You stand, even when you think you can't." Clara swallowed hard, her pulse loud in her ears. "You make me sound braver than I feel." "That's because you don't see yourself the way I do." She dropped her gaze, her fingers twisting in her lap. "I'm not the woman my father wanted me to be, and I'm not sure I'm the kind of woman any man would want." Elias shifted forward, his good hand reaching across the small space between them. "Then you're wrong twice." Her breath caught as his fingers closed gently around hers. The warmth of his touch was steady, grounding. For a moment, neither of them moved, the only sound the soft pop of the fire and the wind brushing against the shutters. "When Coyle looked at you tonight," Elias said, voice low but fierce, "I thought about what it would mean to lose you. Not because you were given to me, not because you're under my roof, but because somewhere between that first ride into the mountains and now, you became mine in a way that's got nothing to do with ownership." Clara's eyes stung, though she fought the tears. "Elias, I'm not good with pretty words," he went on. "But I can tell you this. Out here, there's no law but what you make for yourself. And I've decided my law is keeping you safe. Not just safe, but seen, treated like you matter." Her voice was barely a whisper. "No one's ever said that to me before." He gave a small, almost shy smile. "Then it's about damn time." Silence settled again, softer this time. The oil lamp hissed faintly, its light casting their shadows long on the cabin walls. Clara shifted closer until their knees brushed. "You scare me," she admitted. Elias's brow furrowed. "I'd never—" "Not like that," she interrupted gently. "You scare me because you make me think about staying, about wanting more than just surviving." His eyes searched hers, and whatever he saw there made his voice rough. "Then maybe I scare easy too, because I want the same thing." They stayed like that, their hands clasped, the air between them warm despite the chill creeping in from the mountains. Outside, the coyotes sang to the moon, and inside, under the lamplight, something unspoken passed between them, an understanding, a promise neither needed to put into words. Chapter 8. A Queen in the Mountains. Spring came early to the high country that year. The snow melted from the meadow first, revealing swaths of green dotted with lupin and Indian paintbrush. The river sang louder, swollen with meltwater, and the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine. Clara stepped out onto the porch, the sun spilling warm over her shoulders. She wore a simple cotton dress Elias had brought back from town, a pale blue that caught the color of the sky. Her hand rested lightly over the small swell of her belly. The baby was still months away, but already she could feel its quiet, persistent presence. From the barn came the sound of Elias's voice, low and steady, speaking to the horses. She smiled to herself. He talked to them like old friends, never in a rush. When he emerged, his hat was pushed back, hair ruffled by the breeze, a coil of rope slung over one shoulder. "Fence is holding," he said, stepping onto the porch beside her. "Won't be much for Coil's kind to steal, even if they did come back." "They won't," Clara said softly. "Not after what happened that night." Elias gave her a long look, one corner of his mouth lifting in a wry smile. "You put the fear in them more than I did. That shot of yours," he shook his head, chuckling, "could have sworn you'd been born with a rifle in hand." She laughed, the sound carrying into the meadow. "Not quite." They walked down to the fence line together. The wind teased the wildflowers, sending ripples through the grass. Beyond the meadow, the peaks stood jagged and eternal, snow still clinging to their upper slopes. Elias leaned against the top rail, watching her instead of the view. "You look different," he said after a moment. "How so?" "Like you belong here. Like the mountains claimed you same as they did me." Her throat tightened. "I think they did." She hesitated, glancing up at him. "And you?" He met her gaze without flinching. "I reckon I never believed I'd find someone who could stand this kind of life. It's hard and it's lonely. But then you showed up on my porch, angry, scared, ready to bolt, and now—" He broke off, shaking his head as though words failed him. Clara stepped closer, laying a hand over his on the fence. "Now!" His fingers curled around hers. "Now I can't picture it without you." They stood there in the stillness, the mountains watching like silent witnesses. Clara could feel the truth of his words in the way his thumb brushed over her knuckles, in the steady weight of his presence beside her. After a moment, Elias straightened, pulling something from the pocket of his duster. It was a small silver band, worn smooth with age. "It was my mother's," he said quietly. "Don't have much use for tradition out here, but I figure some things are worth keeping." Her breath caught. "Elias, I'm not a skin because I think you need a place to stay, or because of the baby," he said. "I'm a skin because you're the only person I've ever met who makes this cabin feel like more than four walls. You make it feel like home." The meadow seemed to fall silent, waiting for her answer. Clara's eyes burned, and she fought the swell of emotion in her chest. "Yes," she whispered. 1,000 times, yes." Elias slid the ring onto her finger, his big hand surprisingly gentle. Then he kissed her, slow, deliberate, like a man who understood the way of the moment and meant to savor it. When they pulled apart, the wind had picked up, carrying the scent of sagebrush and the distant sound of a coyote's cry. Clara rested her head against his shoulder, the curve of the mountains rising behind them like a crown. "You know," Elias murmured, "your father might have sent you here as punishment, but I figure he did me a favor." She smiled against his coat. "And you? I'm going to spend the rest of my life treating you like the queen you are," he said. And with the mountain standing guard, the meadow awash in wildflowers, and the man who had once been a stranger holding her like she was his entire world, Clara knew the Wild West could be dusty, dangerous, and unforgiving, but it was also the place where she'd been claimed, cherished, and finally, truly home. The sun hung low, bleeding gold across the open plains, casting the land in firelight. The wind carried the warm scent of sagebrush, stirring Clara's hair as she rode alongside Elias. Below, Dust Creek's distant saloon music drifted up faintly, mingling with the steady rhythm of their horses' hooves. The danger was gone now. Coyle and his men had ridden out for good, leaving only quiet in their wake. But the memory of the fight, the near loss, still echoed between them. They reined in at the ridge where the valley stretched endless before them. Elias looked out over the land, then at her, his storm-gray eyes softer than she'd ever seen. "When your father sent you here," he said slowly, "I thought maybe I was just meant to keep you safe. But somewhere along the way, you became the reason I wanted to live." Her breath caught, the sunset painting his face in light and shadow. "And you," she whispered, "turned my punishment into the only place I've ever wanted to be." He reached across, taking her hand in his, warm and sure. "Then let's stay here together till the mountains turn to dust." They turned their horses toward the setting sun, riding on as two silhouettes against the burning sky, bound by grit, love, and the unyielding heart of the West.